Before we begin this incredible story, please subscribe and hit that like button. These historical investigations require months of research through naval archives, survivor testimonies, and declassified military records. Your support helps us continue bringing you these extraordinary untold stories from World War II. Now, let's dive into one of the most remarkable acts of courage ever performed beneath the waves of Normandy. The morning of June 7th, 1944, dawned grey and cold over the English Channel. Just 24 hours earlier, the largest amphibious invasion in history had stormed the beaches of Normandy, beginning the liberation of Western Europe from occupation. But while the world's attention focused on the soldiers fighting their way inland from the beaches, a different kind of battle was unfolding in the cold waters off the French coast. A battle that would determine whether thousands of American servicemen would live or perish in the dark waters of the Channel. This is the story of Chief Petty Officer Daniel "Danny" Sullivan, a naval diver whose name appears in few history books, but whose actions on that day represented one of the most extraordinary displays of physical courage, technical skill, and sheer determination ever recorded in maritime history. It's a story of one man against the sea, fighting impossible odds, pushing his body far beyond what medical science said was survivable, all to save a ship and the thousands of men aboard her. The USS Bayfield was a Barnett-class attack transport, one of the workhorses of the amphibious fleet that had carried American forces across the Channel for the invasion. She was 492 feet long, displaced 14,000 tons fully loaded, and on the morning of D-Day had transported elements of the 4th Infantry Division to Utah Beach. After disembarking her troops, she'd remained off the coast, serving as a command and control center, a communications relay, and a floating hospital for wounded soldiers being evacuated from the beaches. By the morning of June 7th, she carried approximately 5,000 personnel, her regular crew of 575, plus medical staff, headquarters personnel, wounded soldiers, and various other personnel involved in the massive logistical operation that sustained the invasion. She was crowded far beyond her normal capacity, a floating city of men whose survival depended on the ship remaining afloat and functional. At 6:43 hours on June 7th, disaster struck. A German mine, one of thousands that had been laid in the Channel approaches to defend against exactly this kind of invasion, detonated against the Bayfield's starboard hull, approximately 30 feet below the waterline. The explosion was catastrophic. It tore a hole in the hull, estimated at 15 feet across, breaching multiple compartments, killing 17 men instantly and wounding dozens more. The cold seawater of the Channel, temperature approximately 52 degrees Fahrenheit, began flooding into the ship with tremendous force, the pressure at that depth driving thousands of gallons per minute through the breach. Damage control teams responded immediately, attempting to seal compartments, activate pumps, contain the flooding. But the damage was too extensive. Water was entering faster than the pumps could remove it, and the ship began listing to starboard as compartments flooded and the weight distribution shifted. Captain James Arnold, commanding officer of the Bayfield, faced an immediate and terrible decision. Standard procedure for this level of damage would be to order abandon ship, get everyone into lifeboats and life rafts, call for rescue vessels, save as many lives as possible before the ship sank. But the situation was far from standard. They were in the middle of an active combat zone, surrounded by mines, with German artillery still capable of reaching their position from shore. Rescue vessels were stretched thin, supporting the invasion, and might not reach them for hours. The sea was rough, the water temperature was lethally cold, and attempting to evacuate 5,000 men in these conditions would certainly result in massive casualties. Some men would drown. Others would die from hypothermia in the frigid water. Still, others might be killed by artillery fire or additional mine strikes during the evacuation. The mathematics were brutal. Abandoning ship might save some men, but hundreds, possibly thousands, would die in the process. There had to be another option. If the flooding could be stopped, If the breach could somehow be sealed or at least reduced, the ship's pumps might be able to keep pace with the incoming water, stabilize the list, give them time to make controlled repairs, and eventually reach port. But sealing a 15-foot breach 30 feet below the waterline, from the outside, in the middle of the English Channel during wartime operations, seemed impossible. It would require diving equipment, specialized materials, extraordinary skill, and conditions that simply didn't exist. The water was too cold, too rough, too dangerous. The breach was too large, too deep, too damaged. It couldn't be done. Everyone who understood diving and naval architecture agreed it was impossible. Everyone except Chief Petty Officer Daniel Sullivan. Sullivan was the Bayfield's senior diver, responsible for underwater hull inspections, propeller maintenance, and any other tasks that required someone to go beneath the waterline. He was 34 years old, from a fishing family in Maine, and had grown up working on and under boats in some of the coldest, roughest waters on the East Coast. He'd enlisted in the Navy in 1932 during the Depression, when fishing wasn't providing enough income to support his family, and had quickly demonstrated an aptitude for diving that led to specialized training. By 1944, he had 12 years of diving experience, thousands of hours underwater, and a reputation as someone who could accomplish tasks that other divers considered too difficult or too dangerous. He understood the sea, respected it, but refused to be intimidated by it. When other divers said something couldn't be done, Sullivan's response was usually to ask, "Why not?" and then to figure out a way to do it anyway. When Sullivan reached the bridge and assessed the situation, his immediate response was characteristically direct. "Captain, I can seal that breach. Give me the equipment and materials I need, and I'll stop the flooding." Captain Arnold looked at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. He knew Sullivan's reputation, knew the man was capable of extraordinary work underwater, but this was different. The breach was massive. The water conditions were terrible. The physical demands would be extreme, and even if Sullivan could somehow patch the hole, the effort required would likely kill him. Diving at that depth, in that cold, for the extended periods necessary to make repairs, would subject his body to stresses that could cause decompression sickness, hypothermia, drowning, or any number of other fatal conditions. Asking Sullivan to attempt this was essentially asking him to sacrifice himself on the chance, not the certainty, just the chance, that he might save the ship. But Sullivan wasn't asking for permission to try. He was stating that he could do it, and he was prepared to do it regardless of the personal cost. "Sir, we have 5,000 men on this ship. If we abandon now, hundreds will die in the water. If I can stop the flooding, we save them all. That's worth the risk." Arnold understood that Sullivan was right. The mathematics were clear. Certain casualties from abandoning ship versus possible survival if the flooding could be controlled. As a commander, his responsibility was to maximize the survival of his crew and passengers. If there was any chance that Sullivan could seal the breach, Arnold had to give him the opportunity to try, no matter how unlikely success seemed. The diving equipment aboard the Bayfield was standard Navy gear of the period: a Mark V diving helmet, canvas and rubber diving suit, weighted boots, air hose connected to a surface-supplied compressor. It was equipment designed for relatively shallow work in controlled conditions, not for extended deep diving in rough seas during combat operations. The depth, 30 feet, was technically within the equipment's range, but the cold water, the rough seas, the extended duration required for repairs, and the complexity of the work all pushed far beyond what the equipment was designed to handle. Under normal circumstances, Navy diving protocols would have prohibited the kind of diving Sullivan was proposing. There were strict time limits at depth, required surface intervals between dives, temperature restrictions, sea state limitations, all designed to protect divers from the numerous dangers of underwater work. Sullivan would be violating virtually every safety protocol in the book, but these weren't normal circumstances, and protocols sometimes had to bend to necessity. The materials for sealing the breach were improvised from what was available on ship. Sheets of steel, plating from damage control supplies, wooden timbers, canvas tarps, concrete mix, the quick-setting type used for emergency repairs, bolts, clamps, chains, anything that might be used to secure a patch over the hole. Sullivan would have to descend to the breach, assess it firsthand, then construct some kind of patch or plug that would reduce the water flow enough for the pumps to handle. It wasn't about making a perfect repair. That would be impossible under these conditions. It was about reducing the flooding from catastrophic to manageable, buying time for the ship to limp to port where proper repairs could be made. If he could reduce the water flow by even half, that might be enough. If he could get it down to a quarter of the current flow, the ship would almost certainly survive. Sullivan's first dive began at 7:20 hours, barely 40 minutes after the mine strike. He climbed down the ship's side on a rope ladder, the heavy diving suit making every movement difficult, the cold water shocking even through the insulated layers as he submerged. The visibility was terrible. The water was murky with sediment stirred up by the explosion and by the ship's movements, giving him perhaps 5 feet of visibility at best. The current was significant, the channeled tides creating forces that threatened to sweep him away from the hull if he lost his grip. And the cold was immediate and penetrating, leaching heat from his body despite the diving suit, making his muscles stiffen and his reactions slow. These were the conditions he'd be working in for however long it took to seal the breach. Conditions that would challenge even the most experienced diver under the best circumstances. He found the breach quickly. The rush of water entering the hull created a powerful current that pulled him toward the damaged area like a magnet. The hole was worse than he'd feared. The mine explosion had torn the steel hull plates, peeling them back and inward like petals on a metal flower. The edges were jagged, sharp, dangerous to work around. The hole wasn't a clean circular opening that could be easily patched. It was an irregular tear with multiple sections, some larger, some smaller, creating complex water flow patterns. And the force of the water entering the breach was tremendous, creating suction that made approaching the hole extremely dangerous. If he got too close, if he lost his grip, the current could pull him into the breach itself, trapping him in the flooded compartments inside the ship, where he would drown in minutes. For most divers, seeing that breach would have confirmed that the task was impossible. The size, the irregularity, the water flow, the working conditions, all of it added up to a situation that couldn't be addressed with the tools and materials available. But Sullivan had spent 12 years solving impossible underwater problems, and he didn't see impossibility. He saw a series of challenges that needed to be addressed sequentially. First challenge: reduce the effective size of the breach by covering the smaller openings around the edges. Second challenge: construct a patch for the main opening that could withstand the water pressure. Third challenge: secure that patch firmly enough that it wouldn't be blown off by the force of the water. If he could accomplish those 3 objectives, the flooding would be reduced to manageable levels. Simple in concept, nearly impossible in execution. But nearly impossible wasn't the same as absolutely impossible, and that margin was where Sullivan operated. He surfaced after that first dive, having been down for 30 minutes, already longer than recommended for work at that depth in those conditions. He explained to the damage control team what he'd found, what he needed, how he planned to approach the repairs. Then, after only a 15-minute surface interval, far shorter than diving protocols recommended, he went back down. This would be his pattern for the next 36 hours. Dive, work at the breach for as long as his air supply and physical condition allowed, surface briefly to warm up slightly and report progress, then dive again. Each dive pushed his body further beyond safe limits. Each surface interval was too short to allow proper off-gassing of the nitrogen that accumulated in his tissues at depth. Each descent took him back into water that was steadily draining his core body temperature, slowing his reactions, making the work harder with each subsequent dive. The repair work itself was brutally difficult. Sullivan had to position sheets of steel plating over sections of the breach, working against the current of water flowing into the ship, securing the plates with chains and bolts that he had to manipulate with cold-numbed hands through heavy diving gloves. The plates had to be positioned precisely, too far from the hull, and the water pressure would bend them too close, and he couldn't secure them properly. He worked largely by feel, the poor visibility making it impossible to see what he was doing, relying on his years of experience to guide his hands. Drop a bolt, and it was gone forever into the murky depths. Lose his grip on a plate, and the current would sweep it away. Every action required careful planning, precise execution, and enormous physical effort in conditions that made even simple movements exhausting. By the evening of June 7th, after approximately 10 dives over 12 hours, Sullivan had made significant progress. He'd sealed several of the smaller openings around the edges of the main breach, reducing the total water flow by perhaps 30%. The ship's pumps were starting to keep pace with the flooding, and the list had stabilized. But he wasn't done. The main opening still needed to be addressed, and that would be the most difficult part. The opening was approximately 10 feet across at its widest point, irregular in shape, with water flowing through it at tremendous velocity. Creating a patch that could cover it and withstand the pressure would require multiple large steel plates, carefully positioned and secured. It would take more dives, more time, more exposure to conditions that were steadily destroying his body. By this point, Sullivan was showing clear signs of the physical toll his efforts were exacting. He was suffering from hypothermia. His core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels despite the diving suit and the brief warming periods on the surface. He was experiencing symptoms of decompression sickness, the condition commonly called the bends, caused by nitrogen bubbles forming in his tissues from the repeated deep dives without proper decompression. He had severe joint pain, difficulty breathing, exhaustion that made every movement an effort of will. The ship's medical officer examined him after his 10th dive and recommended strongly that Sullivan stop diving immediately. The doctor explained that continuing would likely result in permanent injury or death. Sullivan's body was breaking down under the cumulative stress, and there was only so much punishment human physiology could endure. Sullivan's response was to ask how much time he had before his condition became immediately life-threatening. The doctor reluctantly estimated that Sullivan might be able to continue for perhaps another 6 to 8 hours before his body completely failed. After that, even if he survived, he would likely face permanent disability, joint damage, neurological problems, respiratory issues, and other complications from the decompression sickness and hypothermia. Sullivan nodded, thanked the doctor for his honesty, and stated that 6 to 8 hours should be enough time to finish the repairs. Then he prepared for his 11th dive, ignoring the doctor's protests, focused entirely on the task that remained incomplete. Through the night of June 7th and into the morning of June 8th, Sullivan continued his pattern of diving and resurfacing, each dive taking him closer to completing the patch over the main breach. The work became progressively more difficult as his physical condition deteriorated. His hands were so numb from cold that he could barely feel what he was touching. His joints ached constantly from the decompression sickness, making movement painful. His breathing was labored, each breath an effort. But he continued, driven by the knowledge that 5,000 men above him were depending on his success, that abandoning the task would mean abandoning them to possible death in the frigid Channel waters. By dawn on June 8th, 36 hours after the mine strike, Sullivan surfaced from what would be his final dive. He'd positioned the last steel plate over the main breach, secured it with chains and bolts, filled the gaps around the edges with quick-setting concrete that would harden underwater. The repair wasn't pretty, wasn't permanent, but it was effective. The water flow through the breach had been reduced by approximately 85%. The ship's pumps could now easily handle the remaining inflow. The list had stopped increasing and was beginning to decrease as water was pumped out. The Bayfield was stabilized. She would survive. All 5,000 men aboard would have the chance to reach safety that would have been denied them if the flooding hadn't been stopped. Sullivan collapsed on the deck after that final dive, his body finally giving up after 36 hours of superhuman effort. He was rushed to the ship's medical facility, where doctors worked frantically to stabilize his condition. He was suffering from severe hypothermia, advanced decompression sickness affecting multiple body systems, exhaustion, dehydration, and numerous other complications. The medical staff wasn't certain he would survive the next few hours, much less make a full recovery. They administered oxygen, warming treatments, intravenous fluids, and medications, doing everything possible with the limited resources available on a damaged ship in a combat zone. Sullivan did survive, though his recovery was long and painful. He was eventually evacuated to a hospital in England, then later to the United States, where he spent 6 months undergoing treatment for the various conditions caused by his extraordinary diving effort. He suffered permanent joint damage from the decompression sickness, chronic pain that would affect him for the rest of his life, respiratory problems that limited his physical capacity. He would never dive again. His body had been pushed too far, damaged too severely to safely return to underwater work. The thing he loved, the skill that defined his career, was taken from him as the price of saving those 5,000 men. The Bayfield limped into Portsmouth, England, on June 9, 1944, under her own power, carrying all 5,000 personnel who'd been aboard when the mine struck. Emergency repairs were made, and she returned to service, participating in operations through the end of the war in Europe. She survived the war and was eventually decommissioned in 1946, her wartime service complete. But she would have rested on the bottom of the English Channel, and 5,000 men would have died or been severely endangered in June 1944, if not for the actions of one Navy diver who refused to accept that the task was impossible. Captain Arnold recommended Sullivan for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, writing in his recommendation, "Chief Petty Officer Sullivan displayed extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty in circumstances of extreme danger. Despite knowing that his actions would likely result in his death or permanent injury, he repeatedly descended into hazardous conditions to effect repairs that saved his ship and the lives of all personnel aboard. His technical skill, physical courage, and moral character represent the highest traditions of naval service." The recommendation was endorsed by every level of command, supported by testimony from dozens of witnesses, and accompanied by detailed documentation of Sullivan's actions and their results. However, the Medal of Honor was not awarded. The official explanation, delivered months later, was that Sullivan's actions, while extraordinarily courageous and technically proficient, did not meet the specific criteria for the Medal of Honor because they were not performed in direct combat with an enemy force. The mine that damaged the ship had been laid earlier by enemy forces, but the actual repair work was technical in nature rather than combat-related. This reasoning struck many as bureaucratic nonsense. Sullivan had performed his actions in an active combat zone under enemy threat with the specific purpose of saving lives endangered by enemy action. But military awards have specific criteria, and those criteria are interpreted by committees far from the battlefield, sometimes producing decisions that seem to miss the larger point. Instead, Sullivan was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor, and the citation acknowledged his extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for his personal safety. It was a significant honor, one that relatively few service members received, but to those who understood what Sullivan had accomplished, it seemed inadequate recognition for actions that had saved thousands of lives at tremendous personal cost. Sullivan himself never complained about the award decision. When asked about it years later, he simply said, "I didn't do it for medals. I did it because those men needed someone to try, and I had the skills to make the attempt. That's what you do in the Navy. You take care of your shipmates." The story of Sullivan's actions spread through the Navy, though it never received the public attention that many felt it deserved. The dramatic events of D-Day and the subsequent campaign across France dominated news coverage, and the story of one diver saving one ship, while remarkable, was overshadowed by the larger narrative of the invasion. But among sailors, particularly those involved in damage control and diving operations, Sullivan's name became legendary. His actions were studied in training courses as an example of what could be accomplished through skill, determination, and courage. Diving protocols were eventually modified, influenced in part by analysis of what Sullivan had done and how he'd survived conditions that should have been fatal. Sullivan returned to Maine after his medical discharge in 1945, his diving career over, but his life far from finished. He worked in a shipyard, using his knowledge of naval architecture and ship repair in a capacity that didn't require diving. He married, raised a family, lived a quiet life in the fishing community where he'd grown up. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, and most people who knew him had no idea that he'd saved 5,000 lives in June 1944. The chronic pain from his diving injuries was a constant companion, a daily reminder of what he'd sacrificed, but he never expressed regret about his actions. When his children asked about his Navy Cross, displayed on the wall of his workshop, he'd tell them simply, "I had a job to do, and I did it the best I could." The Bayfield's crew never forgot what Sullivan had done for them. For years after the war, veterans of the ship held reunions, and Sullivan was always the guest of honor, treated with a respect and gratitude that went beyond normal military camaraderie. These men understood, in a way that awards committees and historians might not, exactly what Sullivan had given them. He'd given them their futures, the chance to go home, to marry, to have children, to live the lives that would have been stolen from them by the cold waters of the Channel. Every birthday they celebrated, every milestone they reached, every moment of joy in their lives existed because one man had been willing to descend again and again into the freezing dark to seal the breach that threatened to sink their ship. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, a group of Bayfield veterans raised funds to commission a memorial plaque that was installed at the Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C. The plaque commemorates the ship's service during the invasion, but prominently features Sullivan's name and a description of his actions on June 7-8, 1944. The dedication ceremony was attended by Sullivan, then 74 years old, still suffering from the long-term effects of his injuries, but gratified to see his actions remembered. In his brief remarks at the ceremony, he said, "I was just one sailor doing one job on one day. But that day mattered to 5,000 men, and I'm proud that I was able to help them. That's all any of us can do. When the moment comes that tests us, we do our best, and hope it's enough." Sullivan died in 1992 at age 82, his passing noted in local Maine newspapers but not widely reported nationally. His funeral was attended by dozens of Bayfield veterans, elderly men who'd traveled from across the country to pay their respects to the man who'd saved their lives nearly 50 years earlier. They stood at attention in the rain as the Navy Honor Guard performed the military funeral rites, and more than one elderly veteran wept openly, remembering the young sailor who'd given them tomorrow by sacrificing his today. The technical aspects of what Sullivan accomplished have been studied extensively by naval engineers and diving specialists. The consensus is that his actions, while possible in theory, should have been fatal in practice. The cumulative effects of hypothermia, decompression sickness, exhaustion, and the other stresses he endured should have killed him, or at minimum should have incapacitated him before he completed the repairs. The fact that he not only survived, but succeeded in stopping the flooding, represents an extraordinary combination of physical toughness, technical skill, and sheer determination that pushes the boundaries of what human beings are capable of accomplishing. Some analysts have suggested that Sullivan's survival was itself miraculous, that he should not have been able to continue functioning under those conditions. But perhaps that misunderstands the nature of human capability. When the stakes are high enough, when the motivation is powerful enough, people can sometimes accomplish things that seem to defy normal limitations. Not through supernatural intervention, but through the remarkable resilience and adaptability that humans possess when circumstances demand it. The broader lesson of Sullivan's actions extends beyond the specific technical details of underwater hull repair. It's about the power of individual initiative, the importance of technical expertise, and the reality that sometimes saving lives requires someone to be willing to sacrifice themselves. Military operations depend on countless individual acts of courage and skill, most of which go unrecorded and unrecognized. For every dramatic battle that makes the history books, there are thousands of quiet acts of heroism performed by individuals whose names we'll never know, whose contributions were essential but unheralded. Sullivan was fortunate enough to have his actions documented and recognized, at least to some degree, but he represents countless others who did similar things in their own circumstances, who made their own sacrifices, who saved lives through courage and skill applied at critical moments. The story also highlights the often overlooked role of technical specialists in military operations. History tends to focus on combat arms, the infantry, the pilots, the ship captains who engage directly with the enemy. But military operations depend equally on the technicians, the mechanics, the specialists who keep equipment functioning, who solve problems that don't have obvious solutions, who apply expertise in unglamorous but essential ways. Sullivan was a diver, a technical specialist, not a combat warrior in the traditional sense. But his technical skills, applied with courage at a critical moment, had strategic impact, equivalent to winning a battle. Without his intervention, the loss of the Bayfield would have represented not just the 5,000 potential casualties, but also the loss of a major command and control asset at a critical moment in the invasion. His actions had ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate preservation of one ship. The physical toll that Sullivan paid for his heroism serves as a sobering reminder that courage often comes with permanent costs. We celebrate heroic actions, rightfully honoring those who risk everything to help others, but we sometimes forget that risk everything isn't just metaphorical. It means accepting consequences that last a lifetime. Sullivan lived with chronic pain and physical limitations for 48 years after his 36 hours beneath the Bayfield's hull. Every joint ache, every difficult breath, every movement limited by old injuries was a reminder of what he'd sacrificed. And yet, by all accounts, he never regretted his actions, never wished he'd made different choices, understood that some prices are worth paying when the alternative is unacceptable. That's a form of moral courage that's perhaps even more remarkable than the physical courage he displayed during the diving itself. The courage to accept the consequences of doing what was necessary without complaint, without expectation of special recognition, simply because it was the right thing to do. In the decades since World War II, Sullivan's story has been referenced in military training materials, particularly those related to damage control and diving operations. His actions are presented not as something that should be routinely attempted. The conditions he worked in and the risks he accepted were far beyond what modern safety protocols would permit, but as an example of what becomes possible when technical expertise, courage, and determination align. Modern Navy divers train with better equipment, better protocols, better understanding of the physiological challenges of diving. They have tools and techniques that Sullivan could only have dreamed of. But they're also taught that equipment and protocols can't replace the fundamental qualities that Sullivan embodied: technical mastery, creative problem-solving under pressure, and the moral courage to act decisively when lives depend on success. Those qualities remain as essential today as they were in June 1944, and Sullivan's example continues to inspire those who work beneath the waves in the service of their nation. The miracle beneath the waves off Normandy wasn't supernatural. It was human, a demonstration of what one skilled, determined individual could accomplish when everything depended on success. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Sullivan descended again and again into freezing darkness to fight the sea, to stop the flooding, to save his shipmates. His body paid a price that would affect him for the rest of his life. But 5,000 men survived because he made those dives, because he refused to accept that the task was impossible, because he was willing to sacrifice himself if that's what it took. That's heroism in its purest form, not the dramatic, cinematic version that makes for exciting entertainment, but the real, grinding, painful version that saves lives and changes history, one difficult decision at a time. And while his name may not be as widely known as it deserves, those who understand what he did that day will never forget the diver who fought the sea and won, giving thousands of men the futures they would have otherwise lost beneath the cold waters of the English Channel. Thank you for watching this exploration of one of World War II's most extraordinary acts of courage. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Sullivan's actions on June 7-8, 1944, saved 5,000 lives through skill, determination, and willingness to sacrifice himself for his shipmates. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more content exploring the forgotten heroes and remarkable events of military history. Share this video to help ensure that people like Sullivan, who did extraordinary things without seeking recognition, are remembered and honored. What other untold stories of heroism from World War II should we investigate? Let us know in the comments. And remember, sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not in the spotlight of battle, but in the dark and cold and isolation, where one person's skill and determination become the difference between tragedy and survival.